Hey everyone, it's Marc Bruin from simplifyinglife.com.au. I was reading through an article by one of my heroes in psychology, Steve Hayes. He's one of the founders of a modality. It's called acceptance and commitment therapy. I work a lot with that. And the article really resonated with me. So I'd like to talk you through what he wrote. And all the credit goes to him. He wrote all this, and then I put my little thoughts to it. He said one of the things that's been bugging him for years is that we work with these generic descriptions in counseling and in psychology as if life can be diminished or minimalized or brought together in averages or in categories or in schematics, if you will. And he says that's actually not a really good way of doing stuff because we are not averages. That's just not who we human beings are. And he said, it generally blocks out alternative thinking because if we think we're all average or normal is the word that gets used quite a lot, then we start to miss the individual aspects of ourselves. He said that's a mistake that often gets made in science. And there's part of a theory behind that. It's the ergodic theorem. Won't bore you with that, don't worry. But the same concept goes in mental illnesses or in mental health problems. He said, if we try to categorize people by putting together a whole heap of symptoms or things that they're going through, then we're making the mistake of thinking that all these symptoms together that we might call major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or acute stress disorder or whatever you want to call it, that actually describes everyone. And science shows us time and time again that describing people by average generally doesn't work because hardly anyone applies to it. So when you look at the average of something, there's only a very few people out of bigger groups that conform to that. All the other ones lie on the outside. They have a completely different range of things going on. I'll give you an example. There was a study done, and this is what Steve writes about as well, with people with major depressive disorder, which is one of the mental illnesses, diseases out of the DSM-5. And when you read it, it sort of seems to describe this hidden yet really unfound mental disease that gives us all these symptoms. And he talked about a study that was done about 3,500 people or more, where they clustered all these symptoms together, and they found that all these people were suffering from all sorts of symptoms, a whole range of clusters of symptoms that if you would have put them all together would only apply to about 5 people out of the whole gamut of people that they interviewed, about 3,500, 3,700 or something. So put simply, all of the clusters of different symptoms that all these people that were suffering from major depressive disorder, that they were suffering from, all these clusters of symptoms, if you put them together and say, well, what's the norm, what's the average, then that would apply only to 5 people out of the 3,700. So 5 people were the average, were the normal, as in that's what all these clusters apply to. All the other people were lying outside in the field somewhere with different sets. So the simple conclusion is you can't just say that people are suffering from major depressive disorder as if that is something that we can compartmentalize into a group of symptoms, because hardly anyone fits those groups of symptoms. We just don't. So there is no normal depression. There is really specific depression with specific symptoms for that very specific person. And bringing it down to averages doesn't work, but we all try and do it, as if that's some sort of tattoo we wear on our back, Steve says. So when you look at mental illness, this is something I've become quite open about with clients, but also in general, because often we come up with protocols to treat people, or we find particular ways to deal with people that suffer from, say, major depressive disorder. And it's dysfunctional to do it that way, because then you would apply the law of averages as if there was one average person or one average description of major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder that all this applies to. And it's just not true. 5 people out of 3,700 were the norm. So when I work with clients and they say, well, I'm dealing with anxiety, or I'm dealing with depression, or I'm dealing with post-traumatic stress, or I'm dealing with whatever, and they think that, I always do it this way, it's a label on their forehead that describes something that is what everyone would be if they feel that, and it's never the case. So as soon as we start sticking very generic labels on what we are experiencing, we're making a big mistake that what we think applies to the group also applies to the individual, because it hardly ever does. So what does that mean in terms of counseling? I don't want to make this too theoretical or philosophical, but what does it mean? It's like, well, it means that we make an error, thinking that what is normal also applies to us, and we make that error. And we look at Instagram, we look at statistics, we look at what groups of people do and what the average of that group of people have done. And then we think we need to conform to that average, whereas the reality is that hardly anyone ever conforms to that average. So we make a really big thinking error, thinking that normal is okay. What does that lead to? Well, it leads to all sorts of symptoms and sensations and mental illnesses and mental ill health expressions that we think can be treated in a particular way because they seem to fit a particular description in a book called the DSM-5 or whatever, and that we have to do it that way, which doesn't work because that book would only apply to 5 people in that study out of 3,700, pretty much. Another one is that we're therefore targeting things the wrong way. And this is something that in a really interesting TED Talk, and I'll put the link in my YouTube channel, a guy called Todd Rose talked about. We do the same in education. Education materials are designed for the average kid, but there is no average kid. There are universal, individual, completely specific kids with their specific needs, desires, and wants. So if you apply all that law of average stuff to them and make them learn average materials, you're never getting out their unique individuality, their unique gifts, and there's something that can be done about it. In terms of mental health, I wrote a couple of things down. It's like, ideally, you would work towards tailor-made, specific sets of tools that apply to the specific life trajectory of that person, because that would be the only way that you can work with that person in a way that suits them. Not because it describes major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, acute stress disorder, PTSD, or work-life balance problems, or whatever is going on. It only caters for that specific person in that specific scenario. And I think Steve says, Steve Hayes says that psychology, unfortunately, has been, over the years trying to help people by looking at those law of average, and in his way, it's not the right way to go about it, which is what acceptance and commitment therapy tries to change. So when I look at my practice, the way that we look at it is we look at your specific situation and just that one. I'm not really too interested about the law of averages or what average normal you would need to connect to or need to commit to, because there is no normal, not really anyway. There are individuals with their individual needs and desires. So you would come to me, and I hope many other therapists along with me, we would look at your very specific situation. And if we can start making progress behaviorally, mentally, emotionally in that specific situation that is your life, then we don't need to look at normal. We can just look at what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and how we can make things better. Now, ultimately, that might lead to general understanding of some stuff, and that's great. But generally, it will not do that. It will be your life lived your way. So I know this sounds a bit theoretical, and I hope it makes sense. The thing to take away is that if you look at yourself as being average, or you're trying to live up to an average, or trying to make things work according to an average, or think that that is a better life to live, you're making the mistake that most of the average things do not apply to people individually. They only apply to an average that is hardly anyone there. So I hope that makes sense. If you've got questions about that, feel free to hit me up on Facebook, email, wherever you know to find me. I'll put that Todd Rose TED Talk in a link in my YouTube channel, and look forward to discussing this with you. Have a great day.